By late 1914, the machine gun had become a weapon without a purpose in the air. Pilots carried rifles, pistols, and even grappling hooks, but the most lethal tool of the war could not be aimed forward. The propeller turned directly in the line of fire. Any attempt to mount a machine gun behind it resulted in immediate destruction of the blades, rendering the aircraft uncontrollable. Engineers proposed wing-mounted guns, but the vibration and recoil made accurate fire nearly impossible. Observers in two-seater aircraft could engage targets, but only from limited angles, and never in pursuit. The fighter, as a concept, did not yet exist because no one could solve the geometry of forward fire. French pilot Roland Garros attempted a solution in March 1915 by attaching steel deflector plates to the propeller blades of his Morane-Saulnier Type L. The system was crude. Approximately 1 in 10 bullets struck the blades, ricocheting unpredictably, but enough rounds passed through to make the aircraft deadly. Garros shot down 5 German aircraft in 16 days. German intelligence recovered his wreckage after an engine failure forced him down behind enemy lines on April 18, 1915. The deflector plates were immediately analyzed, but German engineers rejected the concept. The blades on German propellers were made from laminated wood that splintered under bullet impact. The French design could not be copied directly. Instead, the task of creating a working synchronization system was assigned to Anthony Fokker, a Dutch manufacturer who had been supplying Germany with reconnaissance aircraft since the war began. Fokker's chief engineer, Heinrich Lübbe, had already been developing an interrupter mechanism before Garros's capture. The concept was not new. Franz Schneider of LVG had filed a patent for a similar device in 1913. But no military contract followed. Lübbe's design used a mechanical linkage between the propeller shaft and the machine gun trigger, interrupting fire each time a blade passed in front of the muzzle. Within 48 hours, the system was installed on a Fokker M 5K monoplane and test-fired. The timing was imperfect, with occasional strikes still occurring, but the mechanism functioned. Fokker personally demonstrated the aircraft to German military officials at the Doberitz Proving Ground in May 1915. The gun fired in short bursts, synchronized to the propeller rotation, without damaging the blades. The device was approved for immediate production, but under strict operational security. Pilots were forbidden from flying the equipped aircraft over enemy territory unless absolutely necessary. If forced down, they were instructed to destroy the synchronization gear entirely. The first operational Fokker Eindecker fighters entered service with Feldflieger Abteilung 62 in late May 1915. Early deployments were limited to defensive patrols over German-held territory. Pilots were ordered not to pursue damaged aircraft across the front lines. The goal was not tactical dominance, but concealment. British and French intelligence were aware that a forward-firing system existed, but without physical evidence, they could not determine whether it relied on deflector plates, synchronization, or some other method. German pilots were briefed on the consequences of capture. The synchronization gear was considered a classified weapons system. Loss of an aircraft with the mechanism intact would result in immediate court-martial. This restriction created an unusual tactical environment, where the most capable fighters were held back from offensive operations. Max Immelmann received his Fokker EI in June 1915. He had been flying unarmed reconnaissance aircraft until that point and was unproven in combat. His early victories were not the result of superior skill, but of technological asymmetry. British and French pilots had no defense against forward fire. They could not return fire effectively while maneuvering, and their observers could not track a target directly ahead. Immelmann developed a climbing attack pattern that brought him above and behind enemy formations, allowing him to dive with the sun at his back. The tactic became standard among Fokker pilots. Oswald Bölke, serving with the same unit, refined the approach further. using altitude and surprise to compensate for the Eindecker's relatively weak engine and slow rate of climb. Both pilots were under orders to avoid unnecessary risk. If the synchronization mechanism jammed or malfunctioned, they were to disengage immediately and return to base. Despite these limitations, Immelmann achieved 8 confirmed victories by January 1916, and Bolke reached 12. Their success was not due to ace-level maneuvering, but to a weapons system their opponents could not counter. British losses began to rise in the autumn of 1915. RFC squadrons operating over the Western Front reported a sharp increase in aircraft shot down from head-on attacks. Pilots described a new German monoplane that could fire directly through the propeller arc without deflector plates. Wreckage analysis confirmed the existence of a mechanical interrupter, but British engineers struggled to reverse engineer the system without an intact example. George Constantinescu, a Romanian engineer working in Britain, proposed a hydraulic synchronization system in late 1915, but development was slow. The Air Ministry prioritized pusher aircraft like the DH-2, which mounted the engine behind the pilot, allowing an unobstructed forward gun. These designs were inherently slower and less maneuverable than tractor engine fighters. French development followed a similar path. Newport introduced deflector plates on the Newport 11 in January 1916, accepting the damage to propeller efficiency rather than waiting for a true synchronization system. By early 1916, the Fokker-Eindecker had imposed a localized air superiority that British pilots referred to as the Fokker Scourge. The term was not official doctrine, but reflected the reality of numerical losses and pilot morale. The restriction on cross-border pursuit created a strategic paradox. German pilots held air superiority over their own lines, but could not extend that advantage into offensive operations. British and French reconnaissance aircraft continued to operate with acceptable losses because German fighters would break off engagement rather than risk capture. The synchronization gear remained secret, but its tactical value was limited by the very measures meant to protect it. Oswald Bolke repeatedly requested permission to conduct deep patrols over enemy territory, arguing that the psychological impact of sustained offensive action would be worth the risk of losing an aircraft. His requests were denied until March 1916, when operational doctrine shifted. The German High Command concluded that the technological advantage had diminished sufficiently that containment was no longer practical. Allied intelligence already knew a synchronization system existed. The strategic goal became overwhelming the enemy with production volume rather than concealing capability. The Fokker-Eindecker was not a superior aircraft in terms of speed, climb rate, or structural strength. Its maximum speed was approximately 87 miles per hour, slower than many of the reconnaissance aircraft it engaged. The wings were prone to warping under high G maneuvers, and the control surfaces were underpowered. What made the Eindecker effective was the placement of the machine gun. British pusher fighters like the DH-2 and FE-2 could fire forward without obstruction, but their engines limited top speed, and their gun mounts required the pilot or observer to physically aim the weapon. The Fokker pilot aimed the entire aircraft, using the fuselage as a gun platform. This reduced firing time and improved accuracy, but only if the pilot could position the aircraft correctly. Bolke and Immelmann trained other pilots in deflection shooting, teaching them to lead moving targets rather than firing directly at the observed position. The tactic required understanding the angular velocity of the target and compensating for bullet drop over distance. Most pilots lacked this skill. Analysis of combat reports from 1916 indicated that the average German pilot expended over 500 rounds per confirmed kill, while experienced pilots like Bolke achieved kills with fewer than 200 rounds. The synchronization gear enabled forward fire, but marksmanship determined effectiveness. British attempts to replicate the system were delayed by bureaucratic fragmentation. The Admiralty, the War Office, and the Air Board each pursued separate development programs. George Constantinesco's hydraulic interrupter was mechanically sound, but production contracts were not issued until late 1916. In the interim, the Royal Aircraft Factory adapted a mechanical system designed by Romanian engineer George Scarf, but tests revealed frequent jamming when the gun was fired at high altitude. The French advanced more quickly. Raymond Saulnier, who had developed the deflector plate system used by Garros, completed a true synchronization mechanism in early 1916. The system was installed on SPAD S-7 fighters beginning in September 1916. Unlike the Fokker gear, which interrupted the gun's trigger mechanism, Saulnier's design used a cam-operated linkage that synchronized fire with propeller rotation through a drive shaft. The SPAD system allowed a higher rate of effective fire because it did not rely on mechanical interruption, but on timed firing windows. This meant the gun could be fired continuously without waiting for a mechanical delay between trigger pulls. The introduction of synchronized Allied fighters in late 1916 eliminated the Fokker-Eindecker's advantage, but the doctrinal impact of the synchronization gear persisted. German fighter tactics evolved into formations rather than individual patrols. Bolke formalized these principles in August 1916, creating the Dicta Bolke, a set of tactical guidelines that emphasized altitude advantage, surprise, and coordinated attack. He was assigned command of Jagdstaffel II, the first dedicated fighter squadron in the German Air Service. The unit was equipped with Albatros D-1 and D-2 fighters, which mounted 2 synchronized machine guns instead of 1. The increase in firepower reduced the time required to destroy an enemy aircraft. Bolke's pilots practiced gunnery against ground targets, learning to fire in short bursts to conserve ammunition and prevent barrel overheating. Pilots were instructed to aim for the engine or cockpit rather than the wings or fuselage, as structural damage did not guarantee immediate kills. The goal was incapacitation, not attrition. The British response was slower to materialize. RFC squadrons continued operating outdated aircraft into 1917, suffering losses that exceeded replacement rates. The Sopwith Pup, introduced in late 1916, was the first widely deployed British fighter with a reliable synchronization system, but production numbers remained insufficient. German factories were producing fighters at nearly twice the rate of British manufacturers, and pilot training programs could not keep pace with attrition. By early 1917, the average life expectancy of an RFC pilot on the Western Front was estimated at 3 weeks. This statistic was not published officially, but circulated informally among squadron commanders. The issue was not the synchronization gear itself, which had been successfully copied, but the broader industrial and training infrastructure required to sustain fighter operations. Germany had committed to centralized fighter production in 1915, while Britain maintained a decentralized contracting system that resulted in delays and quality inconsistencies. The forbidden nature of the early synchronization gear had a secondary effect on intelligence doctrine. Both sides began implementing destruction protocols for sensitive equipment. Pilots were issued thermite grenades to destroy gun mechanisms in the event of a forced landing. Aircraft were equipped with self-destruct charges on fuel tanks, though these were rarely used due to the risk of premature detonation. German pilots shot down over enemy lines were interrogated specifically about weapons systems, and several were court-martialed in absentia for failing to destroy their aircraft before capture. The precedent established by the Fokker interrupter extended beyond aviation. Artillery fuses, range-finding equipment, and encryption devices were all subject to similar security measures. The assumption was that any technological advantage, no matter how incremental, would be copied within months if physical evidence became available. This created an operational environment where commanders were reluctant to deploy new systems until mass production was guaranteed. Innovation was delayed, not by engineering limitations, but by strategic caution. The synchronization gear's true impact was not the kills it enabled, but the tactical framework it forced into existence. Before 1915, aerial combat was opportunistic. Pilots engaged when circumstances allowed, but there was no doctrine for sustained air-to-air fighting. The Fokker interrupter created a requirement for counter-tactics, which in turn demanded formation flying, altitude discipline, and gunnery training. By 1917, both sides had developed specialized fighter units with standardized engagement procedures. The aircraft had become a weapons platform, rather than an observation tool. This shift required changes in pilot selection, training duration, and operational planning. Early war pilots were expected to perform reconnaissance, artillery spotting, and occasional combat. Fighter pilots in 1917 were trained exclusively for interception and escort, with no secondary responsibilities. The synchronization gear had not merely enabled forward fire, it had created an entirely new category of military aviation. The mechanical limitations of early synchronization systems imposed constraints that shaped aircraft design for the remainder of the war. The interrupter mechanism required precise timing between the engine's crankshaft and the gun's firing cycle. Any variation in engine speed, caused by altitude, throttle adjustment, or battle damage, could result in the gun firing out of synchronization and striking the propeller. Pilots were instructed to maintain consistent engine RPM during combat and to avoid sudden throttle changes while the gun was firing. This reduced maneuverability during engagements, as aggressive climbs or dives required throttle adjustments that made firing unsafe. German engineers attempted to compensate by designing guns with variable firing rates, but these systems proved unreliable. The Parabellum MG-14 machine gun, introduced in 1916, featured a rate of fire selector, but jamming increased significantly when pilots switched settings mid-flight. Most units reverted to fixed-rate guns by mid-1917. The introduction of twin-gun fighters in late 1916 created new synchronization challenges. Each gun required its own interrupter linkage, and both had to fire in coordination to avoid propeller strikes. The Albatros D-3, entering service in December 1916, mounted two LMG-08 15 machine guns, each synchronized independently. If one gun malfunctioned, the pilot could continue firing with the remaining weapon, but the asymmetric recoil affected aim. British fighters adopted a similar configuration with the SE-5A, which carried a synchronized Vickers gun and a wing-mounted Lewis gun that fired over the propeller arc. The Lewis gun was not synchronized, allowing it to be fired at any time, but its position on the upper wing made reloading difficult in flight. Pilots often exhausted the Lewis gun's 97-round drum early in combat, relying on the Vickers for sustained engagements. The dual-gun arrangement increased firepower, but introduced maintenance complexity. Armorers spent an average of 2 hours per aircraft, ensuring both guns were properly timed, and synchronization drift was a common cause of non-combat propeller damage. By mid-1917, the synchronization gear was no longer a secret technology, but a standard feature on all frontline fighters. The tactical advantage had shifted from the mechanism itself to the skill of the pilot and the performance of the aircraft. The Fokker DR-1 triplane, introduced in August 1917, was highly maneuverable, but suffered from structural failures in the wing spars. The SPAD S-13, entering service at the same time, was faster and more durable, but less agile in turning fights. Pilots adapted their tactics to their aircraft's strengths. German pilots used the triplane's climb rate to gain altitude advantage before diving on slower opponents. Allied pilots used speed to disengage from unfavorable encounters, refusing to enter turning battles where the triplane excelled. The synchronization gear had become invisible infrastructure. Pilots assumed it would work and built their tactics around forward fire without considering the mechanism itself. This assumption was not always correct. Mechanical failures still occurred, and pilots who relied entirely on synchronized guns found themselves defenseless when the system jammed. The late-war development of higher-caliber synchronized guns revealed the limits of mechanical interrupter systems. The Vickers .50-inch machine gun, tested by Britain in 1918, generated recoil forces that damaged synchronization linkages after fewer than 500 rounds. French experiments with 20mm synchronized cannon produced similar results. The interrupter cams wore down rapidly under heavy recoil, causing synchronization drift that could not be corrected in the field. Engineers attempted to compensate with reinforced linkages, but the additional weight reduced aircraft performance. The German Becker 20mm cannon, introduced in limited numbers in 1918, was mounted on twin-engine fighters where synchronization was not required. The firepower advantage was significant. A single 20mm round could destroy an aircraft, but the weapon's slow rate of fire and unreliability limited its tactical impact. By the armistice, no nation had successfully deployed a reliable heavy-caliber synchronized gun on single-engine fighters. The legacy of the forbidden synchronization gear extended beyond its immediate tactical applications. The security measures imposed during its early deployment established precedents for weapons classification that persisted into the interwar period. The concept of protected technology influenced decisions about radar development, jet propulsion, and proximity fuses in the Second World War. The assumption that technological advantage could be maintained through operational security proved incorrect in both conflicts. The synchronization gear remained secret for less than 6 months before Allied engineers developed equivalent systems. The delay in deployment was not caused by the difficulty of reverse engineering the mechanism, but by industrial production timelines and bureaucratic approval processes. The Fokker interrupter's true impact was forcing the rapid development of fighter aviation as a distinct military discipline. The kills attributed to Immelmann, Bolke, and other early Eindecker pilots were not the result of superior aircraft or extraordinary skill, but of a temporary asymmetry in armament. Once that asymmetry was eliminated, the advantage disappeared. The synchronized machine gun did not create fighter aces. It created the conditions under which aerial combat became systematic, measurable, and subject to doctrine. The transformation was irreversible.